And significantly, they feel powerless against crimes. Why not arm all the people? So they have some kind of recourse to a means of self-protection.
On that argument, you would have to supply people with nuclear weapons to defend themselves against the state, yes?
No, well, you're not bringing it up to the level of warfare, organized warfare. That's not what I'm talking about. We have a very small number of crimes in Vermont, comparatively speaking, not just because the population is smaller, but also because people are allowed to be armed, at least in the state of Vermont. I don't like, well, it's not, the Brady Bill disconcerts me because ultimately they're going to build up, the powers that be, police powers on a federal level, are going to build up a tremendous surveillance mechanism to find out who should be entitled to purchase a weapon and who should not. That's scary. I mean, remember the dark side, as it were, you know, the demonic side of the Brady Bill, and that is that we're going to have a national inventory of the American people. If that's what people are prepared to live with and they think it's consistent with democracy, I must express my concern about how they're thinking out the problem of dealing with weapons today. That's one side of the Brady Bill that is not being really explored. It's very anti-democratic in its own way. But I find that in Vermont, where people are allowed to bear arms, even wore concealed weapons in the streets, walking in the streets, I find that this acts in its own way as a deterrent, so far as criminals are concerned. And so crime is almost minimal in Vermont by comparison. And I'm speaking, you know, per thousand people. I'm not talking about the overall size of the state. Because there's always a danger that if you try to rob someone, who knows what will happen to you. I find it shocking, for example, that a woman can be arrested and even subject to jail sentences for resisting an attack by a criminal by the use of tear gas or CN gas or whatever they have, you know, or pepper sprays, because she is carrying a dangerous weapon. In fact, I encountered a situation like that years ago where the man who tried to mug the woman, this is back in the 60s, was freed, you know, whereas the woman herself who resisted the mugging with a tear gas spray instrument was essentially faced with a jail sentence. And I find that ridiculous.
Yet in countries like England, where I think they have about 12% of the guns that we have in the society, they have about 12% of the murders. And it's true across the board. There seems to be a high correlation between number of guns and number of murders.
Theoretically, New York City is supposed to have the most stringent gun laws of any part of the United States, any city. Yet it is known that there are 1 million handguns illegally owned by people in that city. People are more than ready to violate the law so far as weapons are concerned, or restrictions on weapons, on the ownership of weapons, when in point of fact, the economic forces and social forces that produce crime are increased. They become more and more compelling. The so-called lawlessness that exists in the United States today is in great measure a function of vast social dislocations that are taking place to an extent as yet unprecedented in Europe.
Could you comment on something Henry Kissinger said recently? He wrote in the New York Times book review, reviewing a new book about Margaret Thatcher. He said that Margaret Thatcher is the perfect example that choice, not circumstance, leads to human success.
Choice?
Choice.
Oh, that may be true for those where all the circumstances give them the opportunity to make choices. There are endless choices that I would like to follow through on that I can't make. For example, I'd like to take long walks, and I can't. I got arthritis. There's an elementary biophysical fact of life. People living in ghettos often have more and more limited choices, in many cases no choices at all, but to join gangs, to engage in criminal activity, which I suspect they would not want to do if, under other circumstances, they could make choices to live more comfortably, as do many well-to-do, at least affluent, middle-class whites do. I find that a meaningless statement. That's nonsense. Marx put it very well. Human beings make history, but they don't make it under conditions of their own choosing. Okay? So the interplay between choice, namely human beings make history, and the conditions or the choices that are available to them can be limited very much by material factors, by cultural factors, by traditional factors, by overall historical factors. So I find it rather silly to make a statement that choice can overcome circumstances. One looks very closely at Margaret Thatcher's life. Her choices depended very much upon the circumstances in which she found herself.
Two-part question. First, your comment on public education in capitalist society, current society, and what revisions would be made under an anarcho-communist society.
First of all, I believe that very little public education is going on. I believe most of the schools, at least in the United States, or at least far too many schools in the United States, are essentially babysitting operations or means of keeping kids who often have working mothers and fathers off the streets, living wayward lives. In an anarcho-communist society, education would begin, in a sense, at home, whether home is a commune or whether home is a family, extended or more narrow in scope, and education would be a lifetime experience. We wouldn't try to rush people through school so we can send them off to work. In fact, education today is not only largely at least on the elementary and high school level, largely a form of babysitting, so to speak. It is also a form of training for instrumental purposes, namely to suit the needs of industry and commercial concerns, rather than producing wise people. Wisdom comes with a very gradual acquisition of knowledge, not only of skills. So most of our schools today tend to be oriented, and most of our educational approaches tend to be oriented toward giving people skills. And we use that word all over the place. It's very interesting. Where years ago, when I went to school, one talked about classes in enunciating words or speaking properly. Now we talk of language skills. That is to say, in my day, the emphasis that the curriculum placed when it came to modes and ways of speaking and writing was essentially not on an instrumental, was not organized toward an instrumental, industrial, and commercial end. It was essentially centered on improving one's individual capacities to express oneself. And this kind of language, instrumental language, permeates our society today. We speak of social skills. I never heard words like social skills 50, 60 years ago. And nobody even had to teach them to you, as it were. They came out of the communal life, such as it was, neighborhood, consociation, friendships, and everything like that, that one was expected to acquire in everyday life. Now, when everyday life is so insular, so atomized, so fragmented, one has to acquire, quotes, the skills to communicate. you know, as though one were acquiring the ability to drive a nail into a wood plank. We have history skills or historical skills or culture skills. Well, I don't know. I'm using a language that I'm not really familiar with, but that I hear from time to time. Everything is a skill now. And the moral dimensions and the psychological dimensions and the wisdom that should be attached to human activities is removed, and all that is left is the ability to efficiently do something with no regard to what its moral end may be, what its aesthetic end may be, what its social implications may be. And so consequently, I think that this is one of the most horrifying features of the modern curriculum today. That mentality, at least, reveals a very, very pathological attitude toward what I would call education.
And changes under anarcho-communism?
People would be increasingly imbued, hopefully, with wisdom, not only with techniques, understanding, not only with effectiveness, and our education would be directed toward being able to live in a democratic society, so that through discourse, through logic or reason more generally, we would be able to arrive at decisions, share insights, and develop a more vibrant community rather than an efficient entrepreneur, an entrepreneurial marketplace. I mean, we're training people to be entrepreneurs in one form or another today in the present educational system. In an anarcho-communist society, we would be working on the ability of people to form a community, as well as acquire the ability to be as expressive as possible. But the word skills, that belongs in technology. And it reflects the extent to which modern capitalism views any kind of what we would call a community as being some kind of factory. You see, the factory mentality is what now replaces the older pre-capitalist communal mentality, or the anarchic or communistic image of a future as a really cooperative society.
Do you think that there's a canon of works with which people should be familiar?
Of worth?
Works. Philosophical works, works of literature?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't believe that the great tradition of European intellectuality consists of nothing but dead white men. I'm shocked by that kind of statement. What would life be, at least for, in my opinion, for any educated person without a knowledge, for example, of Plato and Aristotle? Always recognizing that these people lived in their time, you know. They weren't so brilliant. I mean, we are not so brilliant, more precisely. When looking back 2,000 or more years, we say that given the, we ignore the context, the historical context in which their ideas were born. We have to see how ideas fill out over the course of history. I regard it as the height of arrogance to look at European civilization, at least the best in European civilization, as being dead. If I see death anywhere, it's when I hear a companion called a significant other. That neutralization, almost technical neutralization of any wealth of expression. To me, a companion is a companion. If one doesn't like expressions like husband and wife, if these seem to be in some way tendentious or gender-oriented, then use the word companion. But when a friend of mine called me up from California, needless to say the great repository of this debasement of language, and said, my significant other, I said, stop. What do you mean by your significant other? Well, the woman I'm living with. I said, you mean your companion? He said, yeah, my companion. I said, use the word companion.